Hi, everyone. Judge Andrew Napolitano here for Judging Freedom. Today is Wednesday, October 4th, 2023. Matt Ho joins us now. Matt, always a pleasure. Thank you very much for coming back on the show. How long do you think it will be before President Zelenskyy is gone by one means or another?
Well, thanks for having me on the show, Judge. Yeah, I think that's a good question. That's a good question. We've seen his wife say he may not stand for election. We've heard that Zelenskyy, who is the head of the Ukrainian armed forces, the head general, is interested in running for president. Certainly, you hear this talk from European and capitals as well as DC about dissatisfaction with Zelenskyy. At the same time, they've built him up into their own words, the Churchill of our era. And he is very good at running around begging for money to the point that it has become almost Monty Python-like. But so whether or not he serves the interests of the ultra-right, the nationalists, the neo-Nazis in Ukraine, as well as continues to serve the interests of the West, and most especially Joe Biden's presidential campaign, that will determine his longevity in his post.
So, and we're going to get to this because of the U.S. hooks deep into Ukraine and the U.S. taking advantage of corruption there. But you think he's a tool of the far right? Do you think he is not being aggressive enough for them, or do you think he's being aggressive as he can possibly be, to the point of being reckless, where they're just using sending human beings into a meat grinder? I mean, stated differently, who is disenchanted with him? The West in Europe, the Oval Office in Washington, the neo-Nazis in Kyiv? Who's disenchanted with him?
I think he has rubbed many people the wrong way. And it's understandable what he's been saying. Ukraine is fighting this war for the U.S. It's fighting this war for NATO. They pulled out of a peace agreement that would have ended this war in the first weeks of the war. They could have had a peace agreement before the war. Right. So Ukraine is fighting this war, as many American officials have acknowledged, for the U.S., for NATO. And so to be denied everything that they feel they need for the war, as well to be given a free hand to, say, launch attacks deep into Russia, which they have, of course, been doing, but they don't have the missile technology, say, to launch the strikes they want to. I think that type of frustration that Zelenskyy has expressed has been taken as a showing of a lack of gratitude by many in the West. And you hear Western leaders see this and push back, as well as what, we talked about this last week, Judge, and we saw what happened in Slovakia with the election of a prime minister who is not that interested in continuing to support this war. But there's a fracturing, right, of the coalition that's occurring that was always going to occur. This was always going to happen because you were holding together 30 some odd countries in this coalition to fight this war that they all knew was no good, that had nefarious beginnings, that wasn't going to serve their interests. And now 19 months into it, as they're heading into another winter, and it's probably going to be a tougher winter than last time, so they're going to have to spend hundreds of billions more of euros on fuel subsidies, right? That stress is really starting to show within this coalition. So I think that's where you see that disenchantment. Certainly, if I was in the Biden administration, I think I'd be overjoyed with Zelenskyy in many ways, because if you look at, say, foreign audiences, say among the American base that supports Joe Biden, they love the guy. Right. They would like to see this guy run for U.S. president or be Biden's running mate. So I think, again, we have to go back to the political interests at play here. And we've said this before. This war continues as long as there's a political benefit to those in power, whether it be in Moscow and Kyiv or in D.C.
Do you think he would risk his life if he were to say to Joe Biden, we can't keep going on. We have to enter into some kind of a peace agreement with Russia? You think he'd be assassinated if he did that?
Certainly, there is that danger. I mean, the long history of American client states show that if you anger them, they will remove you. I mean, there's no doubting that historical evidence. So there is that possibility he could be removed in a coup that would install someone to his right. Remember, when he came in, when he won election, he was campaigning on negotiating a peace in eastern Ukraine with Russia. And then when he comes into office, the ultra-right, the nationalists, the Nazis put a gun to his head and say, nuh-uh, as well as too Victoria Nuland and all her folks, that ilk, the neoconservatives, they're also saying this is how it's going to be. And remember, at the very beginning of this war, in the first couple of weeks of Russia's invasion, Zelenskyy agrees to this peace proposal. He says, yes, we can be neutral. That's what they want. We can be neutral. That will end the war. And then, of course, as those talks went further, by end of March, early April, the U.S. and the British especially have put such pressure on Zelenskyy that the Ukrainians pulled out of those talks.
He has held meetings in Kyiv with the EU foreign ministers. He arranged for the EU foreign ministers to meet in Kyiv. Ukraine is not a member of the EU yet. He acted as if this were a foregone conclusion. The EU is not military, but it's certainly a step closer to NATO. It certainly would be rubbing or shaking his fist into Vladimir Putin's face. But he has also held meetings in Kyiv and in New York. The one in New York that I'm going to mention was not well known until my friend and former colleague at Fox, Charlie Gasparino, got wind of it. It was with Wall Street Titans. Wall Street Titans. Question, Matthew, does Zelenskyy realistically think that he can build a military industrial complex in Kyiv after this war is over? Does he think there will be a Ukraine in which to build it, with the freedom with which to build something like that? Armament facilities.
Well, who knows what he actually believes? Because as you just said, Judge, he's sending an entire generation of young Ukrainians to their death in a war that's unwinnable. So whether or not he's actually sincere in his statements, but certainly what happened at the end of last week over the weekend was this very large conference in Kyiv where hundreds of representatives of weapons makers descended upon Kyiv, and they had this big forum, if you will. Zelenskyy gave this major address promising Ukraine will become the arsenal of the free world, basically saying what we are doing here is we are setting the foundation for the most important military industrial complex in the world. I mean, he said defense industrial complex, which translate that into military industrial complex, the thing that we talk about all the time, the great dangers of that, the thing that Eisenhower famously worried of. This is what Zelenskyy is saying he wants to turn his country into. And of course, that just captures the whole dynamic of this war. This whole idea that this war is a racket, this war is based upon megalomania and greed, and that if you share this view of the war of a binary fashion where either Moscow can win or DC can win, then okay, if Moscow wins, Ukraine loses its sovereignty. But if DC wins, Ukraine loses its sovereignty as well. Ukraine will not be a free nation. It will be a nation owned by Wall Street.
Well, before I get to is corruption a hook? Corruption is so bad. This came out last night, and I think you know this, that Ukrainian troops are told to carry cash. Now, why do they need cash in the battlefield? Because if they're injured, they will need to have the wherewithal to bribe a medic to pick them up. And if they're in a hospital emergency room or hallway, they will need the cash with which to bribe a nurse or a technician or even a surgeon or a physician to care for them. That corruption is that endemic, that expected, and that accepted in Ukraine. Have you ever heard anything so depraved that corruption reaches down to matters of life and death and people bleeding to death?
Sure, in Afghanistan and Iraq, it was the same way, and this is why this war may be different in some ways, but it is the same. It's a progeny of American imperialism. This is a war of the American empire. This is what the United States military and successive White Houses have tried to do for years now, was to make sure U.S. troops aren't directly involved because that's politically costly, and to wage a clear, very deliberate proxy war. But it's based upon the same fundamentals, the same foundations as, say, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And Judge, if you and I are talking about this type of corruption, certainly everyone in Ukraine is aware of it. And so what kind of real support can there be for this government? This government, I've used this phrase before, is a house of cards. Just as the Afghan government was, just as the Iraqi government was, it can be nothing else because it is just simply held up by the amount of money that's being made by the criminal enterprise of the government that comes from foreign suppliers. So there's no foundation to this. There's no underpinning to it. It can only fail, and it only stays inflated as long as that money is being shuttled into it. Once that money stops, this thing collapses, just as it did, say, in Afghanistan in 2021.
So Afghanistan and Iraq disasters that they were not ended by the president who started them. George W. was back in Texas by the time these things were dropped in the laps of others. It's almost inconceivable to me that Ukraine could go on that long, whether Biden runs, whether he's reelected, whether he runs and loses. It's just almost inconceivable to me that this can keep going on. Is there not now a feeling amongst military, diplomatic, and political leaders in the West below the radar screen, not leaked to the media, but whispered by them, that this is over, that Ukraine cannot win, and whatever further military equipment we send is a waste? Example, the Telegram of London, daily newspaper, quoted an unnamed high-ranking British official, whether this is consistent with President or Prime Minister Sunak's government or not, saying we've run out of stuff. We can't send them anymore.
Right, and that's what the Polish Prime Minister and Polish President were saying 2 weeks ago. The same thing.
That's what the old and now new Slovakian Prime Minister will be saying.
And that's what you're hearing from the Pentagon as well. We're running out of things to send, and they have been. The question is whether or not they can prolong the war so that Western manufacturing can catch up. And I know there's been a heavy deindustrialization for decades now, but the idea is you throw the Western idea, the American idea, the model of this is you throw enough at it and we'll catch up. You throw enough money at it and you'll catch up. May not be earmarked by the U.S. Congress for Ukraine, but it will be earmarked for the U.S. military. And we know that U.S. military budgets are not going to fail in this U.S. Congress anytime soon. So the idea is to keep this thing going because, again, is there a political benefit? So if Joe Biden is looking at this and saying, I need to have this war going on for the next 13 months so I can say I'm standing up to Vladimir Putin and, of course, make the connection, as they will, between Putin and Trump because that's the way they think they'll win the race, they will continue to do that. The thing for Ukraine, of course, besides running out of stocks, running out of ammunition, is running out of people. And that's, becoming more and more apparent. The former British defense minister, Ben Wallace said a lot of stupid things. He got a lot of things wrong. So let's all take it as a grain of salt. But he did say last week that the average age of the Ukrainian fighting man is 40 years old.
Wow.
I mean, this idea that they have just gone through the younger generation already, and they have people at the average age 40 shows you this manpower issue. And that, of course, will then come into, there was also something that was pulled back, but the British, I think maybe in the Telegram, had intimated that we will be sending troops into Western Ukraine to help train the Ukrainians. Now, that was walked back and pulled back, but the idea of sending contractors in, mass amounts of contractors, as well as maybe some other nations might send troops in to backfill the Ukrainians so that the Ukrainians can send more people to the front. And just this week, the Ukrainians are requiring all female medical healthcare personnel in their country to register for conscription because they're running out of male healthcare people. So they're going to have to bring up their women into those combat roles, those medical combat roles. So that's the real issue for Ukraine. Do they have enough people to get through the American election? I think the money will come, although I think the Democrats in the U.S. House just did a number on themselves by getting rid of McCarthy because they may get a speaker who is not so interested in seeing that Ukrainian aid money come to the floor. So whereas a week ago, I would have said, they've got 300 votes for Ukrainian aid money in the Congress, in the House, don't worry about it. The Senate's full of plenty of war hawks, more than 60 of them, don't worry about it. Now you may get a speaker who, because of he had to get into that position somehow, has agreed to keep that money off the floor. So the Democrats may have really harmed themselves here in terms of what they say is their biggest priority, not the priority of the American people, but their biggest priority, keeping this war going.
Two comments. One is, if it's Jim Jordan, it's not going to get to the floor.
Yeah.
And Joe Biden has the last nickel he can spend in the presidential drawdown. He's got maybe $5 or $6 billion to go. The other is, I was smiling when you mentioned the British drawback, because Prime Minister Sunak used a very, very British phrase, which we really don't use here, when he had to pull back on, are you going to send troops to Ukraine? He said, quote, not in the here and now.
Right.
I guess that means maybe sometime in the future, which could be next week, but not in the here and now. Here's Hillary Clinton, Gary, cut number 3. Here's Hillary Clinton in a PBS interview earlier today. This fight is our fight, she said.
I know that the majority of Congress is still in favor of supporting Ukraine. So we've got to get through this period. We have to pass legislation and continue to support. And, you know, Jeff, this fight is our fight. Honestly, I don't understand any American siding with Putin, but we've seen it and we've heard it, and we have to fight against it.
So she thinks that people like you and Colonel McGregor and Scott Ritter and Larry Johnson and I and the hundreds of thousands that appreciate the work that we do are siding with Putin, rather than making a prudential argument against American empire and the use of Ukraine as a battering ram with which to drive President Putin from office.
Well, it is disconcerting to see the former Secretary of State on television so much 13 months before the elections. That's a little disconcerting to me, particularly with the state of the current.
One of our guests, I think you know her, retired Lieutenant Colonel Karen Kwiatkowski, said to me, Judge, let me just give you an observation as a woman. That's a campaign hairdo, Hillary. My God, you should have seen the reaction amongst the commenters on the show.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I'm sure the reaction among the commenters was how I feel in my stomach, in my head, and in my soul at hearing that.
She may be off the wall, but she looks pretty good.
and she suits the needs of what the establishment wants, of what the empire wants. I mean, we got to, I think we really have to normalize, as you just did, Judge, using the phrase empire. And when you have one of the darlings of the empire, the heir apparent to it, who lost in 2016, in their minds, not because it was stolen from them, because their entitlement wasn't fulfilled for it. But, you know, this anti-Russia playbook that they've had, I'll give them this, they've been consistent on it. They think it works, and they're going to keep banging that drum. And so you're going to only hear more of this from people like Hillary Clinton, who I don't think anyone is ever going to look at her and say, well, she's a principled person. She certainly is not. But you see where everything in the empire aligns, right? Where she was the most hawkish in the Obama administration. She was getting $500,000 per speech from Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan. She went around the world as Secretary of State, pushing fracking, pushing American oil exports, right? Which is basically the fundamental issue here at stake. Who do the Europeans buy their fuel from? Right. I mean, all these things intersect in Hillary Clinton, and she really is, the darling of the American empire.
I got to show you one more. Cut number 1. She says that President Putin has fomented the opposition to American aid. I'm just quoting what she's saying. American aid to Ukraine. Gary, number 1.
I think Putin is not only thrilled by the divide over whether we continue and at what levels to fund Ukraine, I think he is fomenting it as well. Putin and his team that does the kind of interventions, covert and overt, aiming to undermine democracy and to suborn political leaders, is a big part of how he sees his role.
And I guarantee that
she is the princess of disinformation. She's taking over from Victoria Nuland.
Well, Newland is part of her cadre. I mean,
Yes.
certainly Newland, in the sense that Newland didn't grow up as a Democrat. She was part of the second Bush White House. Was Cheney's national security advisor. So she's not a Democrat in the sense of she used to work on campaigns for them, but she's a neoconservative. And Hillary Clinton is at the top of the neoconservative chart. She really is.
Yes.
She is at I would say too is that you watch this and you just know that all she said about the Russian government being involved and overthrowing other nations and being involved in everyone else's affairs and ineptly meddling, et cetera. There is no pushback at all from the PBS NewsHour host. There is nothing. There is no, well, isn't the United States responsible for dozens and dozens of coups and regime change operations?
Isn't
over
PBS
decades?
owned by the government?
PBS, well, they're funded by it to a degree, but they also receive a ton of money from things like the oil industry, that the people that benefit from these wars, right? If you ever watch them, they'll see, we want to thank our sustainers. And very often it's somebody who is connected to the wars, whether as a financier, as a weapons maker, or as somebody who profits from, general exploitation of people killing one another.
Last question. The corruption in Ukraine, so pervasive, so endemic, so depraved, it reaches to people bleeding to death in the battlefield. Is the U.S. going to use corruption as a hook with which to transform Ukraine into a vassal state of the United States?
I think the idea is to satiate it with so much money and to secure ownership then of it. Politico had a report on Monday about this leaked document from the U.S. State Department that said that corruption was the real threat in Ukraine. I take a step back and say, wait, hey, Russia's got 200,000 man army in Ukraine, killing thousands upon thousands of Ukrainians. They're not the real threat. Corruption is. But again, this goes back to what we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan. The idea behind the U.S. strategy is to condition that corruption so that you get American ownership out of it. So that to say to the Ukrainians, if you want this money to keep coming, you have to do these things, privatize your banks and companies. Well, who has the money to purchase those companies? Wall Street does, right? You have to teach English in your schools, and you have to transition away from Eastern European values, I'm paraphrasing here, and become part of the West. So there's this assimilation by the point of a gun and by bribery. And then, of course, there is as well this idea that you have to fully subsume your military underneath NATO, right? So not just assuming under NATO command or control, but putting it beneath and controlled by the Western weapons makers, right? So all your weapons have to be purchased from our people. And this is what we were saying before about how no matter who wins, there's going to be no sovereignty for Ukraine. Ukraine will have no free will. They will have masters outside of Ukraine, whether they be Russian or American.
Matthew Hill, always a pleasure. Your insight is so welcome, so refreshing, and so spot on. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll see you next week, my friend.
All right. Thank you, Judge.
Of course. More as we get it tomorrow morning early, 8 a.m. Eastern. Professor Jeffrey Sachs from Beijing, and 9 a.m. Eastern from the hills outside of Rome, about as far from Beijing as you can get. Alistair Crook, Judge Napolitano for Judging Freedom.